Hey guys, it's Kevin in my review for Thor Love and Thunder. For this movie, we do, of course, center on Thor. He has taken the last couple years to kind of distance himself away from Asgard. He's now living with the Guardians and things like that. But after a new threat emerges across New Asgard, Thor has to do what he can to recruit a bunch of former allies, including Jane Foster, to stop this new threat from destroying all gods once and for all. So Thor Love and Thunder, I was very excited for this movie. If you guys know, Thor's a character that I've been very back and forth with, I think, in the MCU. The first two Thor films, I'm not gonna lie, I'm really not that big on. The first one, I like all the stuff in Asgard, but once the movie ventures away from Asgard, I don't think it's nearly as good. I don't really like any of the stuff going on within Earth. I think that a lot of the comedy is just very... it just really doesn't work for me in that way, and so I wasn't really big on the first one. And then Thor the Dark World, I legitimately think is like one of the worst comic book movies. It's so incredibly boring, it's so incoherent, it seems to have no idea what to do with this character whatsoever. It just was bottom of the barrel for MCU. I legitimately don't think they're going to ever make a movie on that level, like, ever again. I just don't see it happening, because that film is just so incompetently made. But then we get to Thor Ragnarok, and that was the film that I think completely turned around the Thor character forever. They finally understood what was working about him. They tried to focus less on the things that weren't working. And they also had this more sort of playful tone, and it worked out really well. You had a playful tone, but you also had this really good story of Thor kind of losing sight of everything and everyone, and him trying to, you know, get back what's rightfully his. It was just a really well-done story for Thor, and then everything they did with him in both Infinity War and Endgame, I've been a big fan of. I know a lot of people don't like what they did with him in Endgame, but I thought it was a really good story of him basically having to learn to you know, accept grief and the way that he was processing it, and also, you know, having to accept failure. I think all of that was really well done with the character, and so when they announced that a new Thor movie was coming out, I was pretty shocked. I thought that the next thing we'd be seeing Thor in was Guardians 3, or at least it seemed like that was what was going to happen, considering how Endgame left off, but we, of course, do have this new Thor movie, and I was excited to see what else they were going to do with this character, because obviously he is going to stick around within the MCU. You know, the things that they were endlessly teasing, the different casting announcements. I just thought there was a lot of potential for this film. All the marketing I've really enjoyed quite a bit. Yes, there have been some jokes that have been very different from what we've seen in other films, but I really had a lot of trust in Taika Waititi. I had a lot of trust in, you know, what they were going to do with this character overall, and it kind of disappointed me. I'm not gonna lie, this is easily, I think, one of the biggest mixed bags the MCU has really ever put out. Thor Love and Thunder is a film that I desperately want to like so badly, but it's a film that is so hampered by such an inconsistent tone, so many questionable directions they take these characters in, and overall, it's just a movie where I'm really just having a hard time understanding what they're really trying to do with this character moving forward, and we'll get more into that a little bit later, but we are just going to go ahead and start off with the cast here. And look, while I do have quite a few issues with this movie, the acting really is not one of them. I think all the performances are still really strong here. Everyone does do a really good job. Chris Hemsworth maybe gives his strongest performance as Thor to date, because there is so much that this character has to accomplish. We see him, and he has to do the most ridiculous stuff he has in terms of comedy, and he handles that very well. I've said it before, you know, he's a very good comedic actor. He is good at cracking jokes. He's good at being very charismatic in that way. I mean, Chris Hemsworth, I think, will always be great as this character, and one of the best things about all of these Thor films has really just seen how much his performance has grown, how much he has really just gotten used to the role, and he really does kill it once again within this film. I really liked what he ended up doing here, and the more emotional moments as well. There are some really emotional moments for this character, and I think that's something that Hemsworth does deliver very well. This feels like the most fleshed out portrayal of Thor yet. Obviously, because of everything he's been through, this really does feel like a combination of every Thor that we've seen, the more heroic and serious Thor, combined with the more playful and almost childish Thor that we've seen, you know, in later entries, I think that he did a good job of really meshing those two together, and I thought as a result, Hemsworth just does a really great job. He really does carry this film. He's the thing that really does keep you invested throughout, and I really liked what he ended up doing here. And he continues to be, I think, one of the best portrayals of any MCU character, and I think no matter what they do with this character, Hemsworth's performance is always going to shine, and this film is a big example of that. But I gotta say, for me, really the star of this entire film and the person that I was just very happy to see return is Natalie Portman. Of course, this is her big return to the franchise, and I will be honest with you, I love Natalie Portman. I think she's one of the best actors working today. You put her in every movie, she's probably going to give a really strong performance. Not really been a fan of her in the Thor movies, and it's because I feel like they just have not serviced her well as an actress. She's mainly just played like the reactionary love interest who is adverse to what's going on around her, and she's supposed to react a lot, and the chemistry between her and Thor just was never really there. And so them bringing her back, I thought, had a lot of opportunities, and this is easily the best performance she has ever given as this character. There is so much more depth. There is so much more that she's able to do in this film. I'm not going to get into too much of what's going on with Jane Foster, but let's just say they've given this character a big upgrade, and as such, Natalie Portman just has a lot more to do as an actress here, and I think it is easily her strongest performance to date. She's very funny. I think she fits very well into the comedic tone this film is going for, but she also, I think, really is the heart and soul of this movie. She does a really good job of just getting you to really like the Jane Foster character. This is a character, like I said, I just have not really been too keen on in previous entries, and I feel like here she just did a much better job at really making this character shine through, mainly because she's just given more to do. It didn't feel like Natalie Portman was kind of like holding back here. She really just did a great job at showing her true acting abilities, and I think that alone is one of the best aspects of this entire movie, as well as her and Chris Hemsworth chemistry. I mean, these two are just off the charts, I think, in terms of chemistry. I think they both just do such a great job here. The first film was very much lacking for me. It felt very forced between the two. This is really the first time I feel like the chemistry has felt very natural in that way, and I think the two of them just worked really well together here. This film is many things, but I feel like a romantic comedy is definitely one of the ways to classify it, and it's because of their romantic chemistry that really does make that work overall. So I really liked what they ended up doing here, and I think, you know, if one of the things you're most looking forward to in this movie is Jane Foster, I don't think you will be too disappointed overall, even though I know a lot of people have seen this movie already. As far as the rest of the cast goes, I think everyone does do a really good job. Tessa Thompson is always great as Valkyrie, and I really liked what she ended up doing here. I thought she seemed like she was still having a lot of fun. Taiko Watiti as Korg, I won't lie, in Ragnarok, I was a big fan of him. Here, I thought he was kind of hit or miss for me. There are times where this character really shines. There are times this character is a big scene stealer. And then there are times where I really just felt like he was kind of overdoing it, and I felt that he was kind of a weak link in this movie. The other, sadly, weak link for me was Russell Crowe as Zeus, who I know a lot of people have really liked this performance, that it's very, like, Monty Python-esque and things like that, and he's doing a good job in the role. He's definitely very committed. He definitely is having a really good time. You could almost say, like, watching the movie, he is the person that is having the most fun overall. The problem is, I just don't think his portrayal really ended up working for me, and I'll get more into that with the writing, but his performance is just one that I'm kind of iffy on. I think he definitely gave the effort that was needed. I just don't know if the effort really worked overall for me, so that's something I'm very iffy on. But the other big standout of this movie, who everyone has been talking about, and rightfully so, is Christian Bale as Gore the God, which, yes, I'm sure that you've heard from many reviews, is not in this movie very much, but within that limited screen time, Bale is able to provide so much pathos to this character. This is a character who is so menacing. I mean, there are so many times in this movie where he's so chilling because of how motivated he is, but also how sympathetic of a character he is. There's so much that Bale is able to provide, and it truly just shows how he is one of the greatest working today. He just does such a great job of sinking his teeth into this character. You really do latch on him from the beginning. You know, the opening scene of the film is pretty much all centered around him, and every time Gore pops into the movie just really becomes alive, and I just really loved what he ended up doing here. I think he is easily one of the most standout villains to date. Even in his limited screen time, Gore is a character that I've not been able to stop thinking about, and I think it's because what Bale is able to do. He's just so dynamic as this character, really makes it his own in that way, and I just really like what he ended up doing here. All of the acting here is really strong. Like I said, I think everyone does give a really strong performance here. Okay, now let's get to the directing and the writing, because sadly, this is where my negatives really do start to come through. Now, talking about Taika Waititi as a director, the one thing you will not see me do at any point throughout this review is hate on Taika Waititi, because I've always enjoyed him as a director. I've always enjoyed his style. I've always enjoyed the way that he constructs films, and the thing that I can still say about this movie is this still feels like his vision. It does not feel like he is being stifled. It does not feel like there is somebody else that has come in and has, retroactively ruined the film the way that he wanted to be. No, it feels like he did have a style throughout this. It's very stylized. It's very silly, and he does do a good job at making this film feel like his own. This film does feel distinctive. It doesn't feel like other Marvel movies in that way, similar to Multiverse of Madness this year. It still has its own sort of look and feel to it, and that's something that I think Taika Waititi does do a really good job with. It still feels like he poured his heart and soul into this movie. Unfortunately, I think he kind of took the wrong lessons from his previous film, because what people liked about the previous Thor entry was the fact that we had a director that had his own sense of style and felt like he was able to have it shine throughout the entire movie. And yes, Thor Ragnarok is a very jokey film. There's a lot of comedy inserted into that movie. A lot of it was improv, as we know. The actors have talked about this before. But when the movie needed to get serious, it did get serious. And if you watch back that movie, there are considerable amounts of time where the film is taking breaks and diving deeper into Thor as a character, him kind of losing his identity and having to kind of rediscover himself in that way, having to motivate himself in a way that he hasn't before. He loses so much in that movie, and the film doesn't try to play it for laughs. The film, for the most part, does take it seriously. When the laughs are there, they work really well. But when the film needs to be serious, it is, in fact, serious. And I think that's something that the movie does do a really good job with. And they took the character in a direction that just really, I think, just heightened our love for the Thor character. It elevated his character as a whole. It had this perfect blend of humor and heart. And I'm sad to say, this time around, that balance just isn't really there. Watiti is very much relying more on the comedy here. This film is very joke-heavy, to the point where there are very few scenes in this movie where there isn't comedy inserted. And here's the thing. The comedy, for the most part, I do think has worked up to this point. I think a lot of the comedy has been very fun. And there are some jokes in this movie that do work really well. But the problem is, you have to have, in order for you to have comedy inserted throughout your movie, you have to have a story where the comedy fits naturally, and it doesn't feel like you are forcing it because you feel like you have to have a certain tone. And that's really, I think, the biggest issue with this movie, is that at no point does the comedy in this movie feel natural. It feels like Watiti is doing everything he possibly can to try to top himself from the previous movie and just insert all of these jokes here. And the problem is, one, a lot of these jokes are just very random and they don't really work. Two, the story, and this of course is getting more into the writing here, the story that we're dealing with here is not exactly one that I think should be played for laughs. The story we're dealing with here is actually a very serious one. Jane Foster, without getting into too much, is going through a lot in this movie. She's going through a very personal experience within her life, and that's a big part of this movie, is what she is really dealing with. And that whole part of the film, I think, is very effective when the film wants to dive into that. But the problem is, we don't really get to dive into that all that much because the film is so focused on cracking all of these jokes, and it just doesn't really work in that way. Moments that are supposed to be serious are almost completely played for laughs, and at points the film does border on a parody. There is a recurring joke in this movie you've seen the trailer with these screaming goats, and yeah, at first it's kind of funny, like, oh, there are these goats and they're gonna scream all the time as they transport us to different worlds. And at first it's funny, but then you start to realize that's literally all the joke is that these goats scream a lot. And I just found it to get very tiring after a while. This is one of those movies where they never know when to really end the joke. There are many jokes in this movie that are like that. And like I said, when it comes to Jane, I think the film does do a good job in giving that character a lot more to work with. Her being Mighty Thor and how that all comes about is really well handled. The whole story of her having this power, not really knowing what to do with it, her reuniting with Thor and him kind of being this mentor of sorts, and her kind of getting her to him getting her to understand things, but also her starting to learn things on her own, her channeling different abilities. I mean, all of that is very interesting to watch. And I thought the Jane character, this is easily the best that we have ever seen her. And I thought that is the one thing I am happy about this film existing, is that it gave the Jane Foster character a major upgrade, and I can happily say I like this character now. I like what they ended up doing with her, and I thought everything they did with her in this movie did end up working. The relationship that her and Thor form as well here just feels a lot more natural this time around. It feels like we're really given the time to zero in on their relationship and what went wrong, and kind of them going down, how they can sort of right the wrongs of what ended up happening. And I thought that it just really worked out well in this movie. There's a montage we get early on where we kind of get to see, how the relationship played out, and it just felt like we got a little bit more context into that I think if we hadn't, it would not have changed too much. But I'm just glad that we did, because it just gave me more of a reason to care for these two overall, and I thought they did a really good job with that. But the other thing I did not touch upon with the screenplay is that, yes, Taika Waititi is writing this film, but he's not the only person writing this film. This film is also co-written by Jennifer Caton Robinson, who has done quite a few films. She did I'm Pregnant on HBO Max. She has Do Revenge coming up. She did a movie called Someone Great. So she's known for doing sort of like, dramedies in that way. And you can tell throughout the movie, just these two styles are not working together. Taika Waititi's very playful style, almost Monty Python-esque at points in this movie, is very much clashing with what I think is supposed to be the more emotional moments. I think Robinson was trying to deliver something a little bit more emotional, something a little bit more profound, but Waititi was really getting in the way of this movie. His style this time around just was not working in the way that it usually is. And I think the other thing that really hurts this film is is Gore as a villain, who, like I said, is a tremendous villain. He's very well developed from the beginning. He has a clear motivation. He is trying to get his vengeance of sorts from something that has happened to him. There is a reason why he hates all gods. We get that very early on in the movie as to what exactly happened. There is a fantastic prologue that was taken very seriously and was something that I was very easily able to buy into. I was like, this is actually really well done. This is going to be a great villain. The problem is two things. One, he is not in this movie nearly as much as he should be. So while you feel his presence throughout the movie, you don't see him enough to really feel his menace. You don't really feel the darkness, especially when the movie isn't taking itself seriously a lot of the time. Two, he is the only character in this movie that never once has any kind of joke. He never cracks any jokes. He never says anything funny. He never even has any real quips to him. His character is taken very seriously. He's very menacing. He's very gruesome. He is really trying to mess with these characters' minds, and it just feels like it's clashing with a lot of what the movie is going for. And every time he's on screen, the film just turns so much more serious, and it just doesn't really work, because when he's not on screen, this film is just so ridiculous to watch. I mean, there's a running joke in this movie where there's this love triangle between Thor and Mjolnir and Stormfront. There's a literal subplot where he is trying to, compete for their affections in a way, and the way it's handled is just so stupid. And I understand that they're trying to go for, some really silly comedy, but there's only so far that you can push it, and I feel like they pushed it to a level that was just too much in this movie. After a while, I just really was having a hard time, really staying invested in what was going on, because it just felt like the movie was very much in conflict with itself. You have this one half of the movie that is not taking itself seriously at all. At points, it feels like a Thor parody, which I wouldn't have a problem with if the other half of the movie wasn't so serious in that way. So it just felt like they needed to pick a lane here, or figure out what worked in Ragnarok, try to strike that balance again, and it did not really work here at all, and I think that severely hurts this movie as a result. And while, like I said, there's a lot of good stuff the film does here with Jane and with Gore the God Butcher, and also her and Thor's relationship, virtually every single thing I mentioned is completely undercut by the humor in this movie, and I think that's something else that just really hurts this film. So again, while there's so many jokes, and some of them are funny, I did laugh at some points in this movie. It's not like I never laughed at all. I just think that there is so much more they could have done here plot-wise. Thor does have a clearly defined arc in this movie. I wouldn't say he doesn't have one, but the problem is it's one we have very much seen before, where he's kind of trying to figure out, what is my role in all of this? What am I really meant to do? And we've already kind of seen that with Thor before. His entire arc in Infinity War was him kind of rediscovering himself, and him, realizing that he needs to be the one to get vengeance for what happened to Loki and things like that. And so this film tries to go down kind of a similar route, and it just doesn't really work. It feels like this is really what you're gonna do with this character. You have this whole journey with him in Endgame, and now he's here, and it just felt like it was kind of a rehash of what we've seen before. So it was disappointing, because it kind of made me think, is there anything else we have to do with him? Have we just kind of ran out of ideas? And at points it did kind of feel that way for me. So again, while I think Thor does have an arc in this movie, it doesn't really feel like anything that original. It feels like something we've seen before, and I don't think that really worked very much at all here. Also, the characters of Valkyrie and Korg are completely wasted here. Valkyrie in particular really has nothing to do in this movie. You get the sense that she is the king of New Asgard, but we don't really get to see any of the developments of what's going on there. We get to see some of the things that have changed, but I thought this film was really going to hone in on the responsibilities given to her. She was very unsure if she wanted this position at first, and I wanted to see more of her struggling within New Asgard, and we don't really get to see that here. We get a few glimpses of it here and there, but other than that, Valkyrie is really just here to be a sidekick. She's here to reference things every so often. There is a hint of something that is going on with her that affects her with what Gore is doing and his whole plan, but it's very it is very underwritten, because again, the film is more interested in getting to the next joke, and I think that's what really does end up hurting this movie overall. So again, I think the writing here is just not really that great in this film, unfortunately. Easily, though, the joke that really did fall flat for me is basically everything they did with the Zeus character. I understood the bit of what they were trying to do with him, kind of going in this direction of, never meet your heroes, kind of going down that sort of plot line, but the way they went about it just didn't feel like the Thor we had come to know. And the way that they went about it, again, I felt like I was watching a bad parody film, and I wouldn't really have a problem with that if this wasn't supposed to be in the same universe, if this wasn't canon in that way. But because it is, it just doesn't feel like it fits within the general zeitgeist of what we've come to know from this character before. It just felt like the movie really, again, just wanted to really push that humor, and it just didn't really end up working for me at all. So I just think, there is some comedy that does work. There are some jokes that I thought were pretty funny, but there's a lot here that I just felt there were a lot of missed opportunities. Also, the Guardians in this movie. Let's talk about them. Not really much to say. You see them in the beginning of the film, and they're with Thor a little bit, but they're really just an extended cameo here. All of the stuff you've seen in the trailer is pretty much everything you get with them in the movie, and this was very disappointing to me, because I really felt they had an opportunity here to show Thor living amongst the Guardians, especially that dynamic with him and Star-Lord and, his friendship with Rocket Raccoon and things like that. We don't get to see any of that in this movie. It's all just skipped over, and it feels like this is something that they needed to spend at least, I want to say, another 10 to 15 minutes showing him alongside the Guardians, getting to see him live that life. It's been a while since we've seen this character, and this film really rushes through all of the developments that Thor has been through in that time, and I just didn't really like the way they went about that at all. I felt like that was another missed opportunity that the film really needed to do more with. There's a lot of stuff that just feels very rushed throughout this movie. Getting into the cinematography for this movie, this also is kind of a mixed bag here. There are some things that I think do look really good. The locations of New Asgard and things like that, the different worlds we go to, yeah, it's all really colorful to look at, but some of it also is not the greatest. As people have said before, some of the CGI in this movie is absolutely horrendous. There is one particular shot in general that's going around Twitter, and yeah, it's really bad. I don't know how anything like that saw the light of day. I don't know why there are a ton of scenes in this movie that don't need to be CGI that are. I don't think the CGI is the greatest in this movie. And I know some people are speculating that, like, the Disney Plus version of Thor: Love and Thunder that just came out, they cleaned up some of the CGI. And if that's the case, that's great. But I feel like that's another example of just they needed more time to work on this. They needed more time to construct the images that they were trying to create because they didn't have the time. And now that they did have the time, they were able to clean it up a bit. And I think that's just an example of them waiting to put out the movie. They should have waited to put this out and not just rush it out like they have with a lot of other projects lately, because I think it could have turned out a lot better as a result. But there are some scenes that look really good. There is one sequence especially, and it involves a complete lack of color. And that is all I am going to say. It is easily the standout scene within the entire movie. In terms of action sequences, it's the best action set piece within the entire movie. I think it really is the thing that when it comes to this film, I remember the most. Because aside from that, a lot of the action set pieces are kind of forgettable here. But that really is the one that does stick out to me, as this is like one of the biggest reasons to see this movie. And so I think the cinematography, it's not amazing, it's not complete trash, but it very much is a mixed bag in that way, and I think it definitely could have been a lot better overall. The score here, I will say, I think also is actually really good. That is definitely something I can compliment this film on. I think the score here that is composed by Michael Giacchino is really well done. It's very heroic, it's very powerful. It kind of gives Thor this new theme of sorts, and I really liked what they ended up doing with it. I think Giacchino, he just continues to be one of the best composers working today, and this really is no exception. I really liked what he ended up providing for this movie. And the editing, as I touched upon before, I just think this movie is way too short. This movie isn't even 2 hours long, and I think it very much needed to be. There are at least 15 to 20 minutes missing, I feel like, of this movie that, if they were there, really could have made this film a lot better, especially within the first act. There is so much that we rush through, getting to see Thor with the Guardians, getting to see Thor before this whole mission starts. The film is so adamant about getting to the next scene and getting to the next joke. It never really has any time to flesh out anything, and as a result, it just feels very rushed, and I just felt that the editing just needed to be a lot tighter here. Now, with that being said, everything that I have said about this movie in terms of writing and how inconsistent it is and things like that, some of that did start to get a bit better once the film got to its last 40 minutes. I already talked about that one scene where everything is lacking color, and I will say, for me, this was like the turning point in the film, because after this scene, I actually do think the film got a lot better. Suddenly, I thought they were able to strike that balance a lot better between the humor and between the emotion. The stuff that was supposed to be emotional was emotional. We were diving deeper into things that I wanted to dive into. There were certain nuances of characters that were starting to be revealed that I thought worked really well. A lot of that concerning, the characters of Jane and Gore, they start to dive deeper into both of them, and I thought they did a really good job with that. And the ending itself, I honestly found to be really satisfying. The way they handled it, yes, the film does end on kind of a sad note, but the way they wrap things up, I generally really like the way this movie did end up concluding. I thought it was a good way to end the film. I will say the final scene I'm a bit conflicted on. They kind of ended on this note where they make something seem like this is kind of what we've been building up to all along, but the build-up itself was very subpar. They didn't do a great job of building up to that at all, and I don't think they did a really strong job with that in this movie, so that's something else that just didn't really work for me. But the last 40 minutes definitely was a lot better than the majority of the film. Unfortunately, I'm not reviewing the last 40 minutes. I'm reviewing the film as a whole, and the film as a whole I just think is massively inconsistent. Thor Love and Thunder is a film that is constantly hinting at greatness. There are moments that I really did enjoy within this movie. The Thor character himself, I don't think is completely ruined here. I just think the movie itself is so unbalanced, it ends up being very frustrating in that way until we get to those last 40 minutes in which suddenly the movie does actually get somewhat better, actually having a pretty satisfying ending. This really is just such a frustrating movie for me. The CGI also is very subpar. There's a lot of questionable jokes as well. There's one joke especially that just did not need to be here. It was honestly very problematic in the way they went about it, and I think that's something else that they just could have done better. I just think this is really a movie where Taika Waititi set out to kind of replicate what he did with Ragnarok, but he forgot what works so well within Ragnarok. The heart of that movie is missing here. The emotion that film went for, the genuine emotion, is kind of missing here, but especially the balance that film struck. It just didn't really work this time around. The characters do still work. The interplay between these characters still work. There are some fun jokes here and there. There are some good things about this movie, particularly involving the characters of Jane and Gore. But for everything that works, there's something that doesn't work. And as a whole, when it really came down to it, I just found this to be an example of a film that just needed a lot more time. I think if you know, and this is something a lot of people have said, like the MCU just needs more time. We've seen these articles come out about these, you know, visual effects artists and how terrible it is to work for Marvel because of how much they're constantly feel like they're being rushed and abused and things like that into getting these projects done. And I think this is a blatant example of something that just needed a lot more time, whether it was a script, whether it was visual effects, whether it was Watiti having a better sense of direction. There's a lot that needed to be readjusted in order for this film to fully work, but unfortunately that was not the case, and what we're left here is generally one of the biggest mixed bags within the entire MCU. And so for all of that, I am going to give Thor Love and Thunder overall a C+. Like I said, it's very unfortunate because I really do think they had the opportunity to do some really cool things with the Thor character, and they do some things in this movie, but I really think there just needed to be a lot more that was rethought out here, and I think this is one of the most blatant examples of just a project that just needed a lot more time. But other than that, guys, this is my review of Thor Love and Thunder. Let me know what you guys saw this movie. Love to your thoughts on it. We'll see you guys in my next video, and I will see you guys for that. Okay, bye.